Chapter 6: The Venetian Stranglehold, the Rise of the Republic, the Maritime Monopoly, the Logic of the Lagoon. To understand the global history of black pepper, one must first look at a city built entirely upon mud. Venice first emerged in the 5th century as a desperate haven for Italian refugees fleeing the successive waves of Hun and Germanic invasions that were ravaging northern Italy. These terrified populations fled to the swampy, inhospitable islands of the Venetian lagoon for mutual defense. They chose an environment so utterly hostile to human habitation that no invading cavalry could possibly reach them. This was a landscape devoid of fertile soil, fresh water springs, or natural agricultural resources of any kind. Yet, this profound geographic deprivation was the very catalyst for the city's eventual macroeconomic supremacy. Because the early Venetians could not grow their own wealth from the earth, they were violently forced to extract it from the sea. Over the next 7 centuries, Venice rose steadily from being a minor subject of the Byzantine Empire to becoming its equal partner and ultimately its conqueror. By the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade in the early 13th century, Venice had captured a vast network of Adriatic ports, the island of Crete, and crucial outposts throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This aggressive expansion established a geographic reality that would dictate the flow of global commerce for generations. Venice was positioned at the very northwest corner of the Adriatic Sea, serving as the most direct physical path between the spice emporia of the Orient and the silver mines of the European heartland. The city became the ultimate maritime choke point for the entire medieval world. It was a place where the vast, untamed ocean routes of the East funneled into the tightly controlled, narrow waterways of the European continent. This physical reality allowed the Venetians to begin monopolizing the flow of goods into Christendom. They recognized that whoever controlled the physical space between the Levant and the Alps controlled the wealth of the world. The merchant as state. The Venetian government did not merely regulate trade, it was entirely synonymous with it. The city operated as a mercantile republic, a corporate empire where the machinery of the state existed solely to protect and expand the profit margins of its ruling class. In the late medieval period, an incredibly active financial market allowed Venetians of various ranks to mobilize their savings into highly risky overseas trade ventures. The primary vehicle for this early capitalism was the colleganza contract. This was an innovative contracting institution that allowed a sedentary investor staying in Venice to finance a traveling merchant sailing to the east. The two parties would then split the phenomenal profits upon the safe return of a spice cargo. However, as the wealth of the city exploded, the most powerful families moved to brutally monopolize the political and economic landscape. They sought to eliminate the social mobility that had originally built the city's immense wealth. In 1297, a sweeping legislative act known as the Serrata permanently restricted parliamentary participation to a closed oligarchy of recognized noble families. This small group of elites effectively blocked all political competition and erected insurmountable barriers to participation in the most lucrative aspects of long-distance trade. The Serrata transformed Venice from a dynamic, open society into an entrenched, socially stratified cartel governed by extreme inequality. Once the oligarchy secured its absolute power, it overhauled the organization of the spice trade to eliminate internal competition completely. Instead of allowing private ad hoc voyages to compete against one another, the state took direct ownership of the maritime infrastructure. The Venetian state completely banned private merchant ships known as cogs or carracks from carrying high-value spices like black pepper. From that point forward, the state mandated that pepper could only be transported on publicly owned galleys, ensuring the government could meticulously control the exact volume of spice entering Europe. The factory of ships. To dominate the Mediterranean, the Venetian Republic required a fleet of unparalleled scale and standardization. They built the Arsenal, a massive centralized complex of state-owned shipyards and armories founded in the year 1104. The Arsenal was an astonishing precursor to the Industrial Revolution, functioning as an assembly line centuries before the concept existed in modern manufacturing. It was a highly coordinated, state-sponsored logistical network that allowed Venice to project terrifying naval power across thousands of miles of hostile sea. The crown jewel of this massive shipbuilding operation was the Galea Grossa da Mercado, or the Great Merchant Galley. These vessels were marvels of medieval engineering, designed to be exceptionally long and low on the water. They were powered by large triangular lateen sails and massive crews of highly trained, free citizen rowers. The great galleys were fast enough to outrun pirate vessels and maneuverable enough to navigate the shallow coastal waters of the Adriatic. Furthermore, they were heavily armed with contingents of state-funded marines ready to repel any attack on their precious cargo. Because the state owned these great galleys entirely, the government strictly controlled exactly who was allowed to sail them. The government subcontracted the galleys to private noble merchant companies through a highly regulated, high-stakes public auction known as the Incanto. The Venetian Senate personally convened these auctions and dictated strict regulations that the private contractors had to follow without exception. These rules included the exact departure date, the duration of stops, the specific navigational route, and the required size of the crew. Crucially, only the verified nobles of the post-Serrata regime were allowed to participate in these auctions, keeping the immense wealth generated by black pepper tightly consolidated within a few dozen ruling families. The precision of the Muda. With the ships built and the elite operators selected, the Venetian Senate organized the fleets into a flawless, clockwork system of seasonal convoys. This system was known as the Muda, a term inspired by the strict periodicity of the voyages. The fleets operated on rigid schedules dictated by the seasonal winds, moving with the predictable regularity of migratory birds, operating continuously between 1315 and 1533. The Muda system was the circulatory system of the Venetian corporate empire. The fleets were organized into specific, highly guarded regional routes, such as the Muda of Syria and the Muda of Egypt. A typical convoy consisted of 2 to 5 great merchant galleys traveling tightly together for mutual defense against Genoese rivals and Barbary pirates. They were led by a supreme commander, the captain, who was directly appointed by the Venetian Senate to officially represent the state's diplomatic and commercial interests in foreign destination markets. The absolute precision of the Muda allowed Venice to entirely dominate the European spice supply chain. The convoys left Venice loaded with European raw materials, primarily silver from Alpine mines, German timber, weapons, and finished fabrics. They would return months later with their holds packed to the brim with up to 300 metric tons of Asian spices, predominantly black pepper. When the fleets finally returned to the Venetian lagoon, they left such a profusion of pungent aromas in their wake that their approach could be detected miles away on a favorable wind. The pepper was then funneled directly into the Rialto market, the beating heart of the global economy. Here, under the watchful eye of the state, the Venetian cartel would dictate its final, unyielding price to a desperate European continent. The Mamluk alliance, the middlemen, the gateway of Alexandria. The Venetian galleys did not sail to India to acquire their pepper. They sailed to the shores of North Africa. Since well before the turn of the millennium, the ancient Egyptian city of Alexandria had served as the chief entrepot between the East and the West. Situated at the head of the Nile Delta, it was the ultimate geographic funnel for global commerce. By virtue of its access to the Red Sea, Alexandria was the terminus of a vast, multi-legged maritime and overland journey that originated in the pepper vines of the Malabar coast of India. It was in the bustling, chaotic markets of Alexandria that the spices arrived from the most remote parts of Asia. The pepper was carried first by Indian and Arab dhows, riding the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean. It was then transported overland by massive camel caravans across the brutal deserts of the Arabian Peninsula to the shores of the Mediterranean. For the Venetian merchant, Alexandria was the ultimate gateway to limitless riches. However, it was also a zone of immense geopolitical tension and physical danger. The merchants of Venice were Catholic Europeans doing business in a deeply Islamic territory. They were operating in an era defined by active, violent conflict between Christian crusaders and Muslim defenders across the Holy Land. Yet, the fiercely pragmatic Venetians rarely let religious warfare interfere with the flow of capital. They consistently sought and secured highly profitable, exclusive, and strictly regulated trade agreements with the rulers of Egypt. From the mid-13th century until the early 16th century, the eastern Mediterranean shore was ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks were a formidable military caste who ruled from Cairo, a staggering metropolis of 200,000 inhabitants that dwarfed almost any city in Christian Europe. The Mamluks recognized the immense value of their geographic position and eagerly embraced their role as the ultimate middlemen in the global spice trade. The Sultan's spice. The trade between the Venetian Republic and the Mamluk Sultanate was absolutely not a free market. It was a highly managed institutional exchange between two massive state monopolies engaging in mutual extortion. Under the Circassian dynasty of the Mamluks, the Sultan set up sophisticated economic mechanisms to handle the massive bullion for spices trade. The Mamluks desperately needed European silver and copper to pay their professional military class. The Mamluk armies frequently threatened violent rebellion if their wages or traditional welcoming gifts were delayed. In return, the Venetians agreed to exchange their vast reserves of European bullion directly for the Sultan's heavily guarded spice stocks. This institutional method bypassed regular market exchanges entirely, locking out smaller merchants and independent traders. The Mamluk sultans designated elite private entrepreneurs, known in Arabic sources as the Khawaja, to act as their exclusive financial agents. Venetian merchants spent a significant portion of their time in Alexandria, negotiating with and occasionally befriending these powerful brokers to secure their annual supply of black pepper. Because the Khawaja marketed a substantial amount of the total volume of pepper, Venetian investors were guaranteed a steady, predictable supply. This guarantee, however, was only valid provided the Venetians met the Sultan's increasingly exorbitant asking prices. The Mamluks fully understood that Venice had no other viable supplier, and they frequently manipulated the terms of trade to extract maximum wealth from the Italians. During the 1420s, for example, Sultan Bazbey implemented a radical monopoly policy that severely disrupted the traditional flow of capital. He forced Venetian merchants to purchase immense quantities of pepper directly from his personal warehouses at artificially inflated prices. These forced sales acted as a form of diplomatic tribute, a heavy tax that the Venetians bitterly resented, but ultimately paid. Diplomacy from below. Maintaining this exclusive commercial pipeline required constant, incredibly delicate diplomacy. While grand embassies were occasionally sent to the Sultan's magnificent court in Cairo, the actual daily commercial diplomacy was practiced in the dirt. It was negotiated directly in the bustling, spice-scented marketplaces of Alexandria and Damascus. The agents who handled the daily friction of these forced sales and negotiated tributes were not kings, but the Venetian consuls and the local Muslim judges, or qadis. This localized diplomacy from below allowed the two mercantile communities to cooperate effectively despite the overarching religious and military tensions of the era. The Venetian state maintained a permanent diplomatic representative in several cities under Mamluk control. This ensured they always had direct access to local authorities to resolve disputes over taxation, piracy, or damaged cargo. The ties between the Venetian merchant oligarchy and the Mamluk court were remarkably intimate. In a striking testament to this intertwined relationship, the longest reigning Doge of Venice, Francesco Foscari, was actually born in Mamluk Egypt. The physical reality of the trade in Alexandria was a spectacle of heavily guarded, meticulous logistics. Venetian merchants, flanked by heavily armed marines from the Muda galleys, oversaw the precise weighing of thousands of burlap sacks of black pepper. The spices were carefully measured to the milliare, a standard weight of 1,000 light pounds, ensuring exact taxation and payment. Once weighed and taxed, the pepper was swiftly funneled into the cavernous holds of the Venetian galleys. It was locked away securely beneath the rowing benches, heavily guarded. The fleets then rushed across the Mediterranean, bringing their aromatic cargo to the hungry, waiting markets of Europe. Artificial scarcity. The economics of obfuscation. The manipulated valve. When the Muda fleets finally returned to the safety of the Venetian lagoon, the Republic initiated the second phase of its grand macroeconomic strategy. This was the ruthless implementation of artificial scarcity, a manipulated supply valve. Instead of flooding the European market with their newly acquired thousands of tons of spice, the Venetian cartel carefully hoarded the pepper. It was locked away in massive state-controlled warehouses scattered across the islands. By meticulously restricting the supply released into European markets, the Venetians ensured that demand always vastly outpaced availability. Pepper was not merely a culinary luxury in medieval Europe. It was an absolute necessity for the elite. It was used extensively in the preservation of meats, as a critical ingredient in pharmacology, and as an aromatic element in vital religious ceremonies. Furthermore, it was a quintessential status symbol of the era. Serving highly spiced food was a demonstration of conspicuous consumption, signaling immense wealth and unassailable political power to one's guests. Because the demand was highly inelastic, European nobility were willing to pay practically any price the Venetians demanded to secure their supply. Venice weaponized this desperation, utilizing their exclusive Mamluk trade agreements to establish a near-total stranglehold over the entire European spice trade. They exacted devastating tariffs and markups at every single step of the supply chain. This created a financial engine so powerful that it transformed a city of mud and marsh into the richest financial power on earth. The Venetian state acted as the sole tollkeeper between the riches of the Indian Ocean and the growing economies of the Atlantic world. They were a middleman that produced nothing, yet profited from everything. The arithmetic of monopoly. The sheer scale of the Venetian markup is staggering when observing the physical, granular data of the 15th century spice trade. Even with the heavy taxes imposed by the Mamluk Sultanate, the raw cost of purchasing pepper in Alexandria was minuscule compared to the final retail price in the markets of northern Europe. The contrast between the purchase price in Egypt and the artificially inflated selling price in Europe highlights the absolute ruthlessness of the Venetian monopoly. To truly understand the scale of this price gouging, one must look at the exact financial figures. In the mid-15th century, a bulk purchase of 120 kilograms of raw black pepper in the markets of Alexandria cost a Venetian merchant approximately 61 gold ducats. Upon arrival at the Rialto market in Venice, that exact same 120 kilogram lot was wholesale priced at up to 120 gold ducats, representing an immediate state-sanctioned markup of nearly 100% before the spice even crossed the Alps. By the time Venetian merchants transported the pepper overland to the retail markets of London or Bruges, the price was wildly inflated by protection costs, transport fees, and pure monopolistic profit-taking, frequently selling for between 10 and 17 pence per single pound of weight. To place this into the grim economic reality of the era, the average daily wage for a highly skilled labourer in 15th century England was roughly 4.5 to 5 pence per day. Consequently, a single pound of black pepper in London cost a commoner more than 2 to 3 full days of exhausting manual labour, making it a luxury exclusively reserved for the aristocracy. This arithmetic reveals a fundamental truth about the medieval economy. Pepper was not intrinsically expensive because it was difficult to grow in India. It was expensive because the Venetian Republic systematically ensured it was difficult to acquire in Europe. While freighting costs and the complex shipbuilding industry accounted for some of the markup, the vast majority of the price inflation was pure corporate profit. This wealth was funneled directly into the pockets of the Venetian nobility, who used it to build the ornate palaces that still line the Grand Canal today. The erasing of the map. To protect this staggering profit margin, the Venetian state engaged in aggressive cartographic obfuscation, a deliberate erasing of the map. The Republic understood that their entire empire rested upon a foundation of geographic ignorance. If rival European powers knew the true, physical origins of black pepper, they might attempt to seek out direct maritime routes. This would bypass the Venetian Mamluk choke point entirely, destroying the foundation of Venice's wealth. Therefore, the Republic treated spatial data as its most highly classified, vigorously defended state secret. Venice deliberately guarded its maps, nautical charts, and intelligence networks with a paranoid intensity overseen by the fearsome Council of Ten. The most accurate and vital trade routes, navigational hazards, and deep water ports of the east were encoded in a highly classified manuscript. This book, known as the Libro Piego, was accessible only to the Doge and the highest echelons of the ruling oligarchy. To leak Venetian cartographic intelligence to a foreign power was considered an ultimate act of treason, often punishable by death. By actively withholding accurate spatial data, the Venetians allowed the rest of Europe to wallow in geographic ignorance. They deliberately utilized outdated Ptolemaic specifications on exported maps to confuse rival navigators. For centuries, the true origin of spices remained shrouded in absolute mystery, with consumers widely unaware of the complex Indian Ocean trade network that brought the pepper to Alexandria. The Viper and the Vine. This vacuum of factual information was eagerly filled by fantastical tales, which the Venetian merchants happily perpetuated to their gullible European clients. To further justify the astronomical price of pepper, the Venetians and their Arab trading partners leaned heavily into the economics of obfuscations. They hid the true, mundane agricultural origins of the spice behind terrifying myths and fables. These stories acted as brilliant medieval marketing campaigns. They were designed to convince European buyers that the spices were incredibly rare and profoundly dangerous to harvest. The most enduring of these fables was originally recorded in the classical writings of Pliny the Elder. It was later popularized throughout the Middle Ages by Isidore of Seville's widely read Etymologies. This text claimed that pepper did not grow on standard agricultural farms in India. Instead, the myth stated that pepper grew in remote, inaccessible Indian groves that were heavily guarded by swarms of highly venomous serpents.
According to the legend, the only way for the local farmers to safely harvest the spice was to set the entire grove on fire to drive the vipers away. This fable was a masterstroke of economic propaganda. It ingeniously explained why peppercorns were black and shriveled, claiming the intense heat of the fire charred the originally white fruit. More importantly, it provided a thrilling narrative of mortal peril that easily justified the exorbitant prices demanded at the Rialto market. Pliny the Elder himself had ridiculed these stories as deliberate fabrications put forth by natives to elevate prices. However, medieval Europeans, desperate for the status symbol of spice, swallowed the fable's whole.
By blending cartographic silence with terrifying folklore, Venice successfully masked a highly efficient agricultural supply chain behind a veil of mythical scarcity, the fading of the Serenissima, the Atlantic intrusion. For centuries, the Venetian Stranglehold appeared utterly unbreakable to the rest of Europe. However, the exact geographic isolation that Venice relied upon to maintain its monopoly eventually proved to be its undoing. The astronomical prices of pepper in the European markets acted as a massive, irresistible economic incentive for rival nations to break the cartel. Driven by the desperate desire to bypass the Venetian Mamluk choke point, the Iberian nations of Portugal and Spain began funding highly experimental, deep-water maritime expeditions. The catastrophic blow to the Venetian Republic arrived in the year 1498. It was then that the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama successfully rounded the treacherous Cape of Good Hope. He sailed up the coast of East Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, and finally reached the Malabar coast of India. Da Gama had successfully opened a direct maritime route between the spice-producing regions of Asia and the Atlantic ports of Europe. He had utterly destroyed the Venetian monopoly on spatial data in a single voyage. By documenting the trade winds and coastal geographies of the East, he exposed the true physical reality of the Indian Ocean to the world. The economic fallout for Venice was swift and brutally absolute. My chef freedom proved to were trade strength. The few ships will work do the loading, yet by 1501, terrifying word reached the Venetian merchants that Portuguese ships were returning to Lisbon. Their holds were packed full of pepper, completely bypassing the Mediterranean Sea and the heavy Mamluk tariffs entirely. The Portuguese were suddenly able to offer the exact same high-quality spices to Northern European consumers at fiercely competitive prices. This effectively shattered the artificial scarcity that Venice had maintained for generations. When da Gama returned from his initial voyage, the wholesale price of pepper in some European markets dropped drastically, exposing the staggering artificial inflation of the Venetian cartel to a furious public. The Last Embassy. The Venetian state did not surrender its corporate empire quietly or without a desperate fight. As the long-distance trading network that linked Venice to Cairo entered a period of profound existential crisis, the Republic attempted to leverage its ancient diplomatic ties to stem the bleeding. The Mamluk Sultan, Qansur al-Ghuri, was equally devastated by the Portuguese incursions. These new Atlantic fleets severely disrupted the flow of exotic goods into the Red Sea, cutting off the Sultan's primary source of revenue. In a desperate bid to maintain his own military funding, the Sultan foolishly insisted that the Venetians pay even more for his dwindling spice supplies. He demanded they offset the massive losses caused by Portuguese piracy in the Indian Ocean. In 1503, the Venetian Senate dispatched Ambassador Benedetto Sanudo to the Mamluk court in Cairo to address this collapsing alliance. His frantic mission was to negotiate a new stabilized trade treaty with the Sultan and to coordinate a joint military response to the Portuguese threat. Sanudo arrived bearing elaborate sets of diplomatic gifts, utilizing materially based diplomacy to soothe the heightening tensions. He presented the Sultan with fine Venetian velvets woven with intricate artichoke patterns and exquisite glazed jars. These gifts were a desperate attempt to normalize relations over the rapidly evaporating pepper trade. Despite these frantic diplomatic efforts, the geographic reality of the world had fundamentally shifted beneath their feet. The Mediterranean Sea, once the center of global commerce, was rapidly becoming a peripheral lake. The great Venetian galleys, bound by the seasonal winds of the Muda and the shallow waters of the Adriatic, could not compete with the heavy, ocean-going carracks of the Atlantic powers. While Venice would remain a wealthy and vital center of European culture and printing for centuries to come, its era as the sole arbiter of the global economy was over. The physical flow of black pepper had permanently altered its course, leaving the city of mud and marsh to slowly transform from a ruthless corporate empire into a magnificent, sinking museum.